Thank you so much, House of Speakeasy, for asking me to come out tonight and for such a wonderful introduction. And all of you, I know it's always a challenge to get a crowd when it's so beautiful outside, um, but I appreciate it. I think given what I do, no offense to my other all-star authors for tonight, but given what I do, I think it's particularly apt that I am at the House of Speakeasy. I find it very comfortable to be here. I spend most of my days thinking about researching, writing about whiskey and cocktails and bars and bartenders. I know it's a hard job, but somebody has to do it, which is a long way of saying that really I get paid to drink. A lot of folks, when they hear that, I think get very excited that such a job exists, right? And they have almost like the sort of giddiness around, what I do and the sort of long list of questions that I think they've been keeping in their head just in case they ever cross paths with a liquor expert that they then start asking me questions about. But then there's also other folks who look very puzzled and kind of confused that I would spend my days and time thinking about such matters. It was even worse when I would say that I was a spirits expert, which a lot of people didn't really understand. I remember once I was called for jury duty and I had a book event in another city. I had to move my jury duty service and I went down and kind officer of the court said, sir, what do you do? And I said, I wrote a book about spirits. And he looked at me for kind of an uncomfortably long time and didn't say anything. And finally his eyes opened and he said, are you a very religious man? And I for a second, I didn't exactly know how to answer. I said, I'm sorry, I think you're thinking about other types of spirits. I meant alcohol. And he looked, to be fair, a little crestfallen and maybe a little disappointed. But to his credit, he allowed me to change my jury duty service and go to another city to do my book talk, which is very fortunate. I think also when people hear about what I do, they think that I have a prodigious diet or consumption of alcohol, like somebody like Winston Churchill, that I sit around all day with a bottomless glass of booze. And spoiler alert, that's not actually true. Most days probably have more coffee and seltzer than anything else, but there are certainly days when I have to taste whiskey first thing in the morning or at night, or again, it's a very hard job. But what I love about Churchill is that, he's sort of one of the prototypical sort of subjects that, I find myself researching and thinking about a lot, not just because of what he drank, and that is fascinating in his own right. His biographer talks about how when he would wake up, he would have an eye-opener of Johnny Walker Red highballs, and then continue on through the day drinking brandy and then champagne and more scotch. And while that sounds like a wonderful menu for a party, I certainly could not function like that. But Churchill himself, I think, is sort of indicative of sort of a much larger influence on drinking culture for a number of reasons. One, when he was during Prohibition, he worked in the so-called colonial office, and at a certain point, this anecdote's in Daniel Okeron's fine book, Last Call, the U.S. basically said, hey, would you mind stopping all of the rum runners going from the British, part of the Caribbean to America? The ships are full of alcohol, and if you haven't heard, we don't allow alcohol anymore in the U.S. And Churchill was basically like, yeah, I've heard about that. That's like a you problem, not a me problem. And I'm not going to stop these ships. So, if he had stopped these ships, America would certainly have been a lot drier during Prohibition. So, that's one sort of ginormous effect upon drinking culture. The second thing was, before World War II actually ended, he had the foresight to start giving the Scotch distilleries grain so they could start up again, which was a big thing because he realized, Scotch is something that needs many, many years of barrel aging before it's sold, and obviously after the war was over, he could then, they needed the money to pay off debts, and it also gave them a great, sort of head start over American distilleries that had been closed. But really, one of my favorite stories about Churchill is really about his mother, and I think this sort of speaks to tonight's topic of a long story short, is that a lot of cocktail history is far from straightforward, right? And it's often layer upon layer. It sometimes feels like stripping like an old wood door, right? You're going from story to story to story. And for many years, if you asked, what was the history of the Manhattan, you would be told that Winston Churchill's mother, Jenny Jerome, who was American, was throwing a party for the new governor of New York in the 1874 and at the Manhattan Club, and they created the drink for that party, which is a fabulous story, right? It has everything you need, right? It has who created it, where, the year, and a lot of it does check out. I mean, Winston Churchill's mother was Jenny Jerome. There was a new governor in that year. There's certainly a Manhattan Club. It's not far from here. Unfortunately, Jenny was not in New York at the time. She was back in London preparing to give birth to Winston. So that story doesn't check out. But it's one of these stories that's so wonderful, right? And it's really indicative of what I do and what my colleagues do, where, so much of the time cocktail culture is this thing where you're yelling over the bar and the bartender's like, what do you want? And nobody's writing it down. And after a long night, you go home, and in the morning, you dig out your pocket, you're looking for that note of what you drank, of what the bartender yelled at you, what was in it, and you realize you've written nothing on like a matchbook. And that's kind of the, part of the problem of looking at histories of drinks. But what's funny about the Manhattan now is that, I'm drinking one tonight, and traditionally the recipe is sort of, 2 parts whiskey, rye traditionally, but later bourbon, 1 part sweet vermouth, 2 parts bitters. It's incredibly easy to remember. Why? 212, the original area code for Manhattan, right? So it's super easy to remember. People are like, this is like the recipe, right? It's like carved in stone. But really, when we look at cocktails and how they evolve over the years, the recipe for the Manhattan was surely not 212 when it was invented in the late 1800s. Obviously, whiskey tasted completely different. That's a whole other talk that would take probably 3 hours. Plus, bitters was different and everything else. But really, what's happening in the 1800s is cocktails start with really the old fashioned, right? Which is the original cocktail recipe. The first recipe ever in print comes from a newspaper in Hudson, New York, of all places. In 1806, the editor had run a story that said, had mentioned the word cocktail. Somebody the next week wrote in and said, what do you mean by cocktail? And he said, well, it's a concoction of, different of any kind of spirits, sugar, water, and bitters, right? So basically that's the old-fashioned, right, that you can also enjoy tonight. Out of the old-fashioned comes all the other cocktails. I'd say bartenders are innately curious, sometimes bored. There's a lot of downtime at bars. They start adding new ingredients. Things like sweet vermouth, dry vermouth from France and Italy come into America in the late 1800s. Bartenders start adding that to the old-fashioned. Out of that comes both the Manhattan and the Martini, right? So, I mean, this is like a whole new world that comes from 1 or 2 drinks, but it doesn't really tell us who created these things, right? So we may never know who the first bartender was to mix whiskey and sweet vermouth and bitters, but that sort of doesn't matter, right? And I would say that if you leave here with anything, with any advice or tips, write it down now, early in the night. I would say, 1, drink what you enjoy, right? Do not let anybody tell you what to drink or bully you into drinking something that you don't want to drink. And also, I think the other thing is that, especially we should be kinder to our friends, relatives, bartenders, as we're fighting about exact proportions of things like the Manhattan, the Martini, the old-fashioned, whatever it is, the Mojito, because these things change, right? They change over time. And, really, none of this is set in stone, and they evolve. So cheers to you all for coming out on this cold and rainy night.